Someone get that useless woman out of my OR before she kills another patient. Dr. Raymond Holt's voice cracked like a whip across the entire ward. Every head turned, every conversation died. And there, standing in the middle of the hallway with a patient chart pressed against her chest, was Sarah Stevens, her face pale, her jaw tight, her eyes refusing to fall. The nurses behind the station laughed into their sleeves. One of them, Jessica Crane, leaned over and whispered just loud enough for Sarah to hear. He's not wrong, though. They had no idea. Not a single one of them had any idea who they were standing next to. Before this day was over, a helicopter carrying the most dangerous men in America would land on that roof. And it would land for her. If this kind of story moves you, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Sarah Stevens had learned a long time ago that silence was not weakness. It was armor. She had learned it the hard way, in small rooms with loud people, in hallways where her name was never called first, in operating theaters where her hands did the steadiest work, but her voice was never the one that got the credit. She had learned it in this hospital, Rampart Military Medical Center, a place that should have been built on discipline and respect, but had somehow become a place where the loudest voice always won. And the loudest voice in this building, without question, belonged to Dr. Raymond Holt. He was not a bad doctor. That was the frustrating part. He was, in fact, a genuinely skilled trauma surgeon. Fast hands, sharp instincts, the kind of man who could keep a soldier alive through wounds that would make most people faint just from looking at them. But skill had given him something else too. It had given him certainty. The absolute, unshakable certainty that he was always right, that his way was always the best way, and that anyone who moved more quietly than him was simply moving in the wrong direction. Sarah moved quietly. She always had. It was not shyness, not exactly. It was precision. She had discovered early in her career that when you stop talking and start watching, you see things other people miss. You notice when a patient's breathing shifts 2 minutes before the monitor catches it. You notice when a medication order doesn't match the diagnosis. You notice when a doctor is moving too fast because he's trying to impress someone instead of trying to help someone. She noticed all of it. She just never said it out loud because the one time she had tried, 2 years ago, in a case involving a young corporal with a traumatic brain injury, Dr. Holt had turned to her in front of the entire surgical team and said, "Nurse Stevens, I didn't ask for your commentary, I asked for the suction." The room had gone very quiet, and then someone had laughed. Just one person, just a small sound, but it was enough. It was always enough. After that, she stopped sharing her observations in rooms where Dr. Holt was present. She wrote them in her notes. She flagged them quietly to the attending physicians when Holt wasn't around. She found other ways to make sure the right information reached the right people without having to stand in the path of a man who treated correction like a personal attack. It worked. Patients survived. She kept her head down. Life went on. But survival and respect are different things entirely. This particular morning started the way most mornings at Rampart started. Too fast, too loud, and already behind. The overnight shift had left 3 critical patients in the ICU, 2 fresh admissions from a training accident at the base 30 miles out, and a supply shortage that someone in administration had apparently decided was not urgent enough to resolve before 7 a.m. Sarah arrived 12 minutes early, as she always did, because 12 minutes was the difference between knowing what you were walking into and being blindsided by it. She reviewed the charts at the nurse's station, cross-checking the medication logs against the patient histories, looking for the small errors that accumulated overnight when people were tired and rushing. She found 2. She corrected both before anyone else clocked in. Then Jessica Crane walked through the door, and the morning changed its texture. Jessica was the kind of woman who had never once in her career arrived 12 minutes early for anything. She was blonde, sharp-tongued, with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in a way that actually stuck. She was good at her job in the way that some people are good at performing their job. She looked right. She moved right. She said the right things to the right people at the right moments. The doctors liked her. The administration liked her. The patients often didn't know the difference. She dropped her bag behind the station, glanced at the charts Sarah had been reviewing, and said without looking up, "Did you change these medication logs?" "I flagged 2 discrepancies," Sarah said. The night shift ran a dosing calculation against the wrong weight for the patient in room 4. "I've already noted it for Dr. Ewan." Jessica finally looked up. "You're not supposed to alter logs without authorization." "I didn't alter them. I flagged them. There's a difference." "There is a difference," Jessica said pleasantly. "One of them is your job. The other one is not." Sarah said nothing. She picked up her clipboard and walked toward the ICU, because the conversation had already ended. It had ended the moment Jessica decided that being right was less important than being in charge. That was the thing about Jessica Crane. She was not cruel for the pleasure of it, not exactly. She was cruel in the way that some people are when they have spent their whole careers managing the anxiety of other people being better at things than they are. It came out sideways, in small corrections, in slightly too long pauses before agreeing with you, in the way she would repeat your suggestion in a meeting as if it were her own idea. Sarah had watched it happen to other nurses. She had watched it happen to herself so many times that she had stopped being surprised by it and started simply noting it, the way she noted everything, quietly, precisely, and with the knowledge that patterns always reveal themselves to anyone patient enough to watch. She had been watching Jessica for 3 years. She knew exactly what kind of person she was dealing with. The morning moved forward. Sarah administered medications, updated charts, assisted with 2 procedures in the trauma bay, and ate half a granola bar standing next to the supply closet because there was no other time to eat. This was not unusual. This was Tuesday. The unit was understaffed. It had been understaffed for 4 months, ever since the hospital's contract negotiations with the medical staffing agency had collapsed, and they'd lost 6 nurses in a single week. The ones who remained were stretched past reasonable limits, covering shifts that overlapped, carrying patient loads that crossed the line between demanding and dangerous. Sarah had submitted 3 formal reports about the staffing situation. She had delivered them through the proper channels, to the unit supervisor, to the nursing director, to the hospital administrator's office. She had included data, patient outcome statistics, error rate correlations, comparative benchmarks from similar facilities. She had done everything right. The reports had been received, acknowledged, filed. Nothing had changed. So she kept working. Because what else do you do when the system doesn't respond? You don't stop taking care of the patients in front of you just because the people above you have failed. You keep your hands moving and your eyes open, and you do the work that needs to be done, even when no one is watching, even when no one says thank you, even when the woman 3 feet away from you mutters under her breath that you corrected a medication log that wasn't yours to correct. You keep going. By 11 o'clock, the ICU had stabilized enough that Sarah had a brief window at the nurse's station. She was updating her documentation when Dr. Holt came striding down the hallway with the particular walk he had when he'd just come from a successful procedure. Chin up, shoulders back, moving at a pace that suggested everyone around him should either be keeping up or getting out of the way. He stopped at the station. He looked at the board. He looked at Sarah. "Stevens," he said, "the patient in room 7, what's his current status?" Sarah didn't pause. Corporal Dennis Marsh, 23 years old, admitted 18 hours ago with bilateral lower extremity trauma following a vehicle incident during training exercise. He was stabilized overnight. His vitals have been consistent for the last 4 hours. His pain management is currently on a scheduled protocol, and he had a restless night. I've noted that his anxiety levels seem elevated. I'd recommend a consult with the psych team before discharge. Holt stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "His vitals are consistent. That's all I needed." He moved on. Behind him, Jessica looked at Sarah with an expression that was almost impressed. Almost, before she caught herself and looked back at her screen. Sarah went back to her documentation. It was 40 minutes later when everything changed. The call came through the radio at the front desk. Not the internal system, not the standard dispatch line, but the emergency military frequency that was only activated for the highest priority situations. The nurse at the front desk, a young woman named Danny, who had been working there for less than 6 months, picked it up with uncertain hands and then stood very still for a moment before she said, loudly, to the entire room, "We have incoming, multiple casualties." Navy, they said Navy personnel. They said, she stopped. She looked at the radio. They said to have your best trauma team at the roof access in 8 minutes. The unit went from Tuesday to something else entirely. Holt appeared from around the corner almost immediately. He must have heard the radio from the hallway. He was already shifting into command mode, pointing at people, calling out names. "Carson, Ewan, get to the roof access. Crane, get a trauma bay prepped. I need 2 more nurses." "I'll go," Sarah said. Holt looked at her. It was a brief look, not unkind, but not warm either. "I need experienced trauma response up there, Stevens." "I know," she said. "That's why I volunteered." Something crossed his face. Not respect, not yet, but a flicker of something that wasn't dismissal either. "Fine," he said. "Go." She was already moving. The elevator to the roof access felt like it took 3 times longer than it actually did. Sarah stood in it with Dr. Ewan, a quiet, methodical man she genuinely respected, and 2 orderlies with transport equipment. No one spoke. The radio crackle coming through the wall of the building told them everything they needed to know about the urgency of what was coming. Dr. Ewan looked at her. "You know anything about what they were doing out there?" "No," Sarah said, "but from the way that call came in, I'm guessing they didn't want us to." He nodded slowly. "Yeah." The elevator doors opened. The roof was already loud, not with people, but with wind, and with the unmistakable sound building in the distance that meant rotors were close. Sarah stepped out into the gray morning air and felt the gust hit her before she saw anything. She scanned the landing area, checked the clearance, positioned herself where she would have the fastest access to the first casualty off the aircraft. She had done this before. Not many nurses had. She had done it in a different hospital 3 years ago before she transferred to Rampart. A mass casualty event from a roadside explosive incident, 17 injured, 4 critical, chaos on a scale that rewired something in her brain permanently. After that day, she had studied every protocol for military trauma response she could find. She had taken 2 additional certifications. She had practiced scenarios in her head late at night when she couldn't sleep. She had never told anyone here about that day. It was not something she talked about. It was simply something she carried, the way she carried everything, quietly and with purpose. The helicopter came into view. It was not a standard medical transport. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that. It was military, a configuration she recognized from her studies, a bird built for speed and stealth rather than comfort or capacity. It was coming in fast, and it was coming in low, and the pilot was good, very good, because they touched down on that roof with a precision that should not have been possible at that speed. The doors were open before the rotors had fully slowed. 2 men in tactical gear jumped out first, not injured, but scanning the roof with the automatic assessment of people trained to evaluate threats before anything else. They looked at the medical team. They looked at Sarah specifically for just a moment in a way that was not accidental. Then the third figure came out. He was being supported by a 4th man, large, steady, moving with the contained urgency of someone who had been trained to function at maximum capacity, even when everything around him was falling apart. The injured man was conscious, barely, but conscious. His gear was dark with blood in several places, and his left arm was held at an angle that told Sarah, before she had taken a single step toward him, exactly what category of injury she was dealing with. She moved. "What do we have?" she called out, directing the question not to the tactical men, they wouldn't give her clinical details, but to the figure still supporting the patient, because that person would have been watching the injury since it happened. "GSW, left shoulder, possible fragmentation. He's been holding pressure for 40 minutes. Possible secondary injury to the left side. He's been guarding it since extraction." Sarah was already kneeling. Her hands went to the pressure point first, confirming the hold, assessing the compression. The patient's eyes found hers. He was young, younger than she expected. His face was pale and tight with pain, but his eyes were focused, and that mattered enormously. "You're at Rampart," she said, keeping her voice even and direct. "I'm Nurse Stevens. I've got you. Can you tell me your pain level, 1 to 10? He swallowed. 7, he said. His voice was steadier than his color. "Good, that's good. You're doing well." She looked at Dr. Ewan. "I need a secondary assessment on the left lateral. He's been guarding it, possible rib involvement, and I need his pressure checked now." Ewan was already there. Behind her, she heard Holt's voice. He had come up as well, apparently, barking instructions at the orderlies. Normally, she would have deferred. Normally, she would have stepped back and let the senior physician take point. But the patient's eyes were on her, and something in the way he was holding himself told her that the moment she stepped back, something was going to go wrong. Not because of Holt, but because this patient needed consistency right now, needed one voice, one face, one steady presence to hold him together while the chaos of the roof sorted itself out around him. So she stayed where she was. She stayed, and she kept talking to him, and she kept her hands exactly where they needed to be. And when Holt moved past her to examine the shoulder wound, she shifted her position by exactly 8 inches, enough to give him access, not enough to remove herself from the patient's line of sight. Holt noticed. She felt him notice, but he said nothing. The patient, she didn't have his name yet. They hadn't had time for that. The patient reached out with his right hand and, with the grip of someone who had trained his entire life to hold on to things under pressure, took hold of Sarah's wrist. Not grabbing, not panicking, just holding. "You're going to be okay," she said. She meant it. She would not have said it if she didn't mean it, because false comfort was a kind of lie, and lies had no place in this moment. But she had looked at his vitals. She had assessed the wound. She had felt the pressure and read the situation with 22 years of training, telling her exactly what she was seeing, and she meant it. He closed his eyes for 1 second, then opened them again. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." They moved him to the transport, and the orderlies took the equipment, and the tactical men fell in around the gurney in a formation that told her, very clearly, that this was not an ordinary soldier. She walked beside him all the way to the elevator. At the doors, one of the tactical men, the one who had given her the injury report, stopped beside her for just a moment. He didn't look at her directly. He looked straight ahead, the way military people sometimes do when they're saying something they want to seem casual. "You stayed with him," he said. "Good call." The elevator doors closed. Sarah stood in the hallway and breathed. Around her, the unit was still moving. Nurses with equipment, doctors with clipboards, Danny at the front desk looking like she was trying very hard to appear calm and failing somewhat. The noise was familiar. The motion was familiar. But something had shifted. She could feel it, the way you feel the weather change before the rain actually arrives. Something in the pressure of the air. Something in the way the light falls. It was not about her. It was not about recognition or credit or any of the things she had long since stopped expecting. It was about the patient. The young man who had held her wrist on that roof and said, "Okay," like it was a decision he was making, not a hope he was surrendering to. She went back to work. 2 hours later, when she was updating his chart and confirming the surgical team had him stable, She finally learned his name. She read it twice. Then she set the chart down carefully because her hands had started to shake. Not from fear, not from exhaustion, but from the particular kind of tremor that comes when you realize that the ordinary moment you thought you were living in was actually something else entirely. She didn't know it yet, not fully, but the quiet had started to change. The name on the chart was Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb. Sarah read it twice, the way she'd already read it once before setting the clipboard down. She picked it back up, read it again. Because names like that don't just appear on charts in military hospitals without carrying weight behind them. And Sarah Stevens had been working in military medicine long enough to know that certain names came attached to certain silences. The kind of silence that fills a room not because nothing is happening, but because too much is happening somewhere else that no one is allowed to talk about. She set the chart down a second time, more carefully this time. Marcus Webb. She knew that name. Not personally, she had never met the man before today. But 3 months ago, there had been a briefing. A mandatory security update for all senior medical personnel at Rampart. The kind of briefing delivered by a man in a suit who never introduced himself and spent 40 minutes explaining what information could and could not be documented in open medical records. Marcus Webb's name had not been spoken in that briefing, but the description of the unit he commanded had been there, buried in a single sentence about high-value asset protection protocols. And Sarah had written it down in the margins of her notes because she wrote everything down. She had not told anyone about those notes. She had not told anyone about what she was now holding in her hands. She closed the chart, walked to the supply room, stood alone for exactly 45 seconds, breathing slowly, organizing what she knew into what she needed to do next. Then she walked back out and got to work. The surgical team had Webb in the OR within 22 minutes of landing. That was fast, faster than standard protocol, which told Sarah that Holt had made some calls she wasn't aware of, or that someone above Holt had made those calls for him. Either way, the machine was moving, and her job right now was to make sure the machine had everything it needed. She pulled the supply requisition for the OR, cross-checked it against the surgical plan, and found one item missing, a specific type of hemostatic gauze that was not on the standard trauma cart, but that she had personally requisitioned 2 weeks ago after reading a case study on its application in fragmentation wounds. She had ordered 6 units. They were in the second shelf of the supply closet, behind the standard inventory, because whoever had received the delivery had filed them incorrectly. She retrieved them, delivered them to the OR doors, handed them to the scrub tech without a word. The scrub tech looked at them, looked at her. "These aren't on the order." "They should be," Sarah said. "Dr. Holt will want them when he gets to the secondary site. Tell him they're there." The doors swung closed. She stood in the hallway. Behind her, she heard Jessica's voice first, the specific tone Jessica used when she was performing concern rather than feeling it. The slightly elevated pitch, the careful word choices that made everything sound supportive while landing like a small knife. "Sarah." She said it the way you say a name when you're about to deliver news you're enjoying delivering. "The nursing director wants to see you." Sarah turned. Jessica was standing with her arms crossed and her head tilted, and there was something in her expression that was almost satisfied. Almost. Like she had been waiting for this particular moment and was trying not to let the waiting show. "When?" Sarah asked. "Now," Jessica said, her words. The walk to Director Paulson's office took 3 minutes. Sarah used every second of those 3 minutes to decide what she was going to say and, more importantly, what she was going to hold back. Linda Paulson was not a bad person. Sarah had worked for bad people and she knew the difference. Paulson was a bureaucrat in the specific sense that she believed in systems above all else. Not because she was lazy, but because she had seen what happened when systems broke down, and she had spent her entire career trying to prevent it. She was careful. She was procedural. And right now, Sitting behind her desk with her hands folded on top of a manila folder, she looked like a woman who had received information she did not enjoy receiving. "Close the door," Paulson said. Sarah closed it. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand if that's all right." Paulson looked at her for a moment. "Fine." She opened the folder. "I have a complaint here, filed this morning, citing unauthorized alteration of patient medication records." Sarah felt the specific quality of stillness that comes not from peace, but from restraint. "I flagged 2 discrepancies in the overnight logs. I didn't alter them, I annotated them with a correction note, which is within nursing protocol for—" "I know what the protocol says, Sarah." "Then you know I didn't violate it." Paulson looked down at the folder again. "The complaint also cites an incident in the trauma bay last week, where you allegedly gave a direct instruction to an orderly that contradicted a physician order. The physician order was entered incorrectly. The attending confirmed it afterward. After you had already acted on it. After I had already prevented a dosing error, yes." The silence in the room had a weight to it. Sarah could feel it pressing against her chest, but she kept her breathing even, kept her posture steady, kept her face exactly as still as it needed to be. Paulson closed the folder. "Do you understand why this puts me in a difficult position?" "I understand that someone filed a complaint," Sarah said. "I don't understand why a complaint about correct action is being treated as a problem." "Because it's not about the action, Sarah. It's about the manner." Paulson leaned forward slightly. "You have a reputation in this unit. I'm not saying it's a bad one. Your patient outcomes are among the strongest in the department. Your documentation is thorough. Your error rate is the lowest on the floor." She paused. "But you make people uncomfortable." Sarah waited. "Specifically," Paulson continued, "you make Dr. Holt uncomfortable. And Dr. Holt is the senior attending on this ward. And when senior physicians feel undermined—" "With respect," Sarah said, and she kept her voice so perfectly level that Paulson stopped talking entirely just to hear what came next. "A physician who feels undermined by a nurse correcting a medication error is not someone who should be made more comfortable. He should be made more accurate." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Sarah had said all day. Paulson stared at her. Something moved behind her eyes, something that looked a great deal like agreement, before the bureaucratic instinct closed over it like water closing over a stone. "I'm going to document this conversation as a counseling session," she said finally. "I'm not filing a formal reprimand, but I need you to be aware that you are being watched and that the next escalation will be handled differently." Sarah nodded once. "Is that everything?" "That's everything." She was halfway to the door when Paulson said, quietly, "For what it's worth, the corporal in room 4, the one with the dosing error you caught, his wife came in this morning. She brought flowers for the nurse's station." She paused. "I thought you should know." Sarah kept her hand on the door handle. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. She stepped back into the hallway. Jessica was not waiting outside the door. Sarah had half expected her to be, but the feeling of being watched was still there. The specific awareness that something in the unit had shifted today, that the helicopter on the roof had changed the social geometry of this floor in ways that nobody had fully calculated yet. She had been back at her station for less than 10 minutes when Danny appeared at her elbow, looking like she was carrying a secret and not handling it well. "There's a man," Danny said too quietly, "at the front desk. He asked for you specifically. He didn't give a name." Sarah looked up from her documentation. "What did he look like?" Danny thought about it with the careful expression of someone who had just realized that the details of this might matter more than she'd initially assumed. "Tall, short hair. He's not in uniform, but he is, you know. Like the clothes are regular, but the way he's standing is not regular at all." Sarah put down her pen. "Tell him I'll be there in 2 minutes," she said. She finished the notation she was working on because incomplete documentation was a problem regardless of what was waiting at the front desk. and then she walked out to the reception area. He was exactly as Danny had described. Average height, actually, not tall, but the posture made him seem taller. Close-cropped hair going gray at the temples. A face that had spent significant time outdoors. Civilian clothes that fit correctly in the way that only happened when the body underneath them had been built by years of specific physical discipline. He was looking directly at her when she came through the door, which meant he'd already identified her before she'd identified him, which told her something. "Nurse Stevens," he said, not a question. "That's right." He extended a hand. "Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reyes. I was on the bird this morning." She shook his hand. His grip was controlled, firm without performing firmness, which was rarer than people thought. "How is he?" she asked. She didn't say the name. They were in a reception area. Reyes's jaw moved slightly. "Still in surgery. They say another 2 hours." He looked at her steadily. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened on the roof." "All right." "Not here," he said. She glanced at the front desk. Danny was absolutely pretending to look at her computer and absolutely failing at it. "Give me 5 minutes," Sarah said. She told Danny she was taking a break, which she was owed technically 3 times over at this point, and walked with Reyes to the family consultation room at the end of the east corridor, which was empty. They stood on opposite sides of the small table, and Reyes looked at her with the particular assessment of a man who had spent his career deciding who to trust and how fast. "You knew he was guarding the left side," Reyes said, "before the diagnostic, before anyone else looked." "His body language indicated it," Sarah said. "People in pain protect the source. He was rotated about 3 degrees to the right, which for a right-handed person under stress means the left side is the priority site." Reyes was quiet for a moment. 45 minutes in that helicopter," he said. "2 of my guys were telling him the shoulder was the main event. He almost believed it." He paused. "You knew in about 8 seconds. I've been doing this for a long time." "I know." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He didn't hand it to her, he just held it. "We did our own assessment of the medical team here before the bird landed. Standard protocol for casualty transport to a non-dedicated facility. We had your file." Sarah said nothing. She was very still. "Your record from Mercy General," Reyes continued. "The mass casualty event 3 years ago. 17 casualties, 4 critical. You were the primary nursing contact for 2 of the 4 critical patients." He looked at her directly. "Both survived." "Other people made that happen," Sarah said. "It's not Nurse Stevens." His voice was not unkind, but it was precise. "I've spent 15 years working with people who deflect credit. I know what that sounds like. And I know the difference between deflection and accuracy." He set the paper on the table between them, but kept his hand on it. "You called the secondary injury. You stayed with him when the attending tried to take over. You kept him calm during a transition period that could have destabilized him significantly." He paused. "Those were not small things." "They were my job," Sarah said. "Yeah." Something shifted in his expression. "People keep saying that today. Your colleagues say it like it's a limitation. You say it like it's a code." She didn't have an answer for that. Reyes lifted his hand from the paper. It was a typed document, official-looking, with a letterhead she recognized. Not because she had seen it before, but because she had studied military medical command structure in her certifications, and she knew what the insignia in the upper corner meant. She picked it up, read it again. "This is a request for my personnel records," she said. "It's a preliminary inquiry," Reyes said. "Nothing formal, nothing binding." He clasped his hands in front of him on the table. "But I want to be honest with you, because I think you're someone who prefers honesty to management. There's a conversation that may be happening in the next 24 to 72 hours. It may involve some people asking you some questions. I don't want you to be blindsided by it." Sarah set the paper down. "What kind of questions?" The kind that happen when someone demonstrates a specific skill set in a high-visibility situation. He looked at her steadily. You may be asked about your interest in a different type of work. The room was very quiet. Sarah thought about the chart. She thought about the counseling session. She thought about the medication logs she had corrected at 7 in the morning and the complaint that had been filed about them before 9. She thought about 3 years of documentation submitted through proper channels and filed without action. She thought about the granola bar she had eaten standing next to the supply closet. She thought about the young man on the roof who had held her wrist and said, "Okay," like it was a decision. "I have patients," she said, "right now, on this floor. They're why I came to work this morning." Reyes nodded. "I know. Whatever conversation happens in 72 hours," she said, "it doesn't change what I do between now and then." "No," he agreed, "it wouldn't." He stood, tucked the document back inside his jacket. "One more thing," he said, and there was a slight change in his voice, the smallest shift, something that might have been personal rather than professional, if you were paying close enough attention. "He said your name." She looked up. "In the elevator coming down from the roof." He was in and out of focus. Blood pressure had dropped. But he said your name. Reyes looked at the door, then back at her. "I don't know if that means anything to you. I just thought you should know," he said it. He left. Sarah sat in the family consultation room alone for a moment, just one moment. Then she stood, straightened her scrubs, and walked back to the unit. She was passing the nurse's station when she heard it. Not a shout, something more controlled than that, which somehow made it worse. Holt's voice, just inside the break room, talking to someone she couldn't see. "The woman has no concept of the chain of command," he was saying. "She second-guesses every order. She goes above the attending on medication decisions. And now apparently she's having private meetings with military personnel during shift hours. I don't care what her outcome stats look like. A nurse who doesn't know her place is a liability, not an asset." There was a response she couldn't hear clearly. Another voice, lower, more careful. Then Holt again. "Paulson should have put a formal reprimand on her file months ago. If she won't, I will." Sarah stood in the hallway. Her jaw was tight. Her hands were still. Every single thing in her body was moving in 2 directions at once. The part of her that had been quiet for 3 years, that had absorbed and absorbed and absorbed, pulling back, pulling in, keeping the armor up. And something else, something new, something that had started on a roof with a helicopter and a man who had said her name when he couldn't remember anything else. She stepped into the break room. Holt was standing with his back to the door. The other person was Dr. Yuen, who saw Sarah first and whose expression did something complicated in the space of about half a second. Holt turned. For a moment, the 3 of them were simply in a room together, and the only sound was the hum of the coffee machine. "I need you to review the secondary imaging on the patient from this morning," Sarah said. Her voice was completely even. "The left lateral films came back, and there's something on the 4th rib that I think warrants a second look before Dr. Webb is moved to the recovery unit." Holt stared at her. "How do you know his name?" "I'm his primary nursing contact," she said. "It's on the chart." Ewan said, very quietly, "I'll pull the films." "Thank you," Sarah said. She looked at Holt for one more second. Not challenging, not submissive, simply present. Simply there. "I'll be at my station when you're ready." She turned and walked out. Behind her, she heard nothing. No comment, no dismissal, no muttered remark. Just silence. She walked back to the nurse's station, sat down, and went back to her documentation. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. But something behind her eyes was burning. And it had been burning since the moment she had read that name on the chart. And it was not going to go out anytime soon. 2 hours and 40 minutes after the helicopter had landed on that roof, an OR nurse named Carla appeared at the entrance to the ward and said, to no one and everyone at once, "Surgery's done. He's stable. Vitals are strong." Someone at the far end of the station exhaled audibly. Sarah did not exhale. She simply made a note in her documentation, at the correct time, with the correct details. Then she looked up at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds. Stable, he was stable. She looked back down at her work. At the other end of the station, Jessica Crane was watching her with an expression Sarah had never seen on her face before. Not mockery, not satisfaction, something quieter than that, and more unsettled. Like someone who had been very certain about a person for a very long time and had just started to wonder if they'd been looking at the wrong thing all along. Sarah didn't acknowledge it. She had work to do. The rest of that afternoon passed the way afternoons pass when something enormous has already happened and the world hasn't caught up to it yet. Fast on the surface, strange underneath, every ordinary moment carrying a weight it didn't used to carry. Sarah worked her full shift. She administered medications, updated charts, assisted with 2 non-critical procedures, and handled a family consultation for the corporal in room 4, whose wife had brought flowers that morning. She did all of it with the same steady hands she always used, the same measured voice, the same attention to detail that had defined her work for 22 years and been noticed by almost nobody in this building until today. She did not go to the recovery unit to check on Marcus Webb. That was not her assignment. He had a surgical team, a post-op nurse, and, she was fairly certain, at least one of Reyes's people stationed somewhere nearby. Her presence would have been unauthorized, and Sarah did not do unauthorized things simply because she wanted to. She wanted to. She did not go. She clocked out at 6:47 in the evening, 13 minutes after her shift officially ended, which was actually early for her. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, moving quickly, alone, because the evening shift had already filtered in, and the room was briefly empty. She was pulling on her jacket when the locker room door opened. It was Carla, the OR nurse who had delivered the news about Webb's surgery 4 hours ago. She was still in her scrubs, and she was holding a piece of paper the way people hold things they're not sure they should be holding. "Someone left this at the OR nursing desk," Carla said. "They said to give it to you at end of shift." Sarah took it. It was a folded note, plain paper, no letterhead this time. She opened it. 4 words, a room number, a time, 7:15. She looked at Carla. Carla looked back with the expression of someone who has decided, very deliberately, not to ask any questions. "Thanks," Sarah said. "Yeah," Carla said, and left. Sarah stood in the empty locker room and looked at the note for a moment. Room number 42 was in the East Wing, 3rd floor. Post-surgical recovery private rooms, the kind of rooms that were technically for patients, but were occasionally used for other purposes when the administration needed a space that wasn't on the primary floor. She knew, with a clarity that needed no explanation, that this was the conversation Reyes had warned her about, the one he'd told her was coming in 24 to 72 hours. It was coming in 28 minutes. She folded the note carefully and put it in her pocket. Then she walked to the cafeteria, got a cup of coffee she didn't need, but wanted for something to do with her hands, and sat at a corner table for 25 minutes, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. At 7:12, she took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The hallway was quiet, a single nurse at the station at the far end, not looking her way. Sarah walked to room 42, knocked twice, and opened the door. There were 3 people in the room. Reyes, she recognized. The second man, she didn't know. Civilian clothes again, but with the specific posture of military authority that she was beginning to recognize as a category unto itself. He was older, 60s maybe, with the kind of face that had been making decisions for so long it had stopped looking like anything else. The third person was Marcus Webb. He was sitting up in the bed, which he should not have been doing this soon after the surgery he just had. But Sarah took one look at him and understood immediately that this was a man for whom should not was a suggestion rather than a rule. He was pale and careful in his movements, his left arm immobilized, monitors attached, IV running, and his eyes were clear and direct and focused on the door the moment she walked through it. "Nurse Stevens," the older man said. He didn't stand. "My name is Admiral Gordon Trace. Please sit down." Sarah sat. She looked at Webb. "You should be horizontal," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in that direction. "I've been told," he said. His voice was stronger than she expected, given what he'd been through. "I told them I wanted to be sitting for this." "For what?" she said. Admiral Trace folded his hands on the small table beside him. He had the deliberate manner of a man who had delivered important information so many times that he'd developed a specific rhythm for it. Unhurried, but precise. Each word placed exactly where he intended it. "What do you know about Task Medical Support Unit 7? He asked. Sarah held his gaze. "Not much. I know it exists. I know it's attached to a specific operational command within Naval Special Warfare. I know it's not listed in any public directory." She paused. "I know it's the unit that was referenced in our facility security briefing 3 months ago, without being named directly." Trace looked at Reyes. Something passed between them. Not surprise exactly, but confirmation of something they had apparently already suspected. "How do you know that?" Trace said. Not accusatory, genuinely curious. "I pay attention," Sarah said. Webb made a sound that was definitely a suppressed laugh, and then controlled it quickly, probably because laughing hurt. "TMSU-7, Trace said, provides specialized medical support for high-risk extraction and operational missions. It's small, intentionally, 6 personnel, rotating assignments, embedded with various SEAL teams on a mission-by-mission basis." He looked at her steadily. "We lost our primary trauma nurse 6 weeks ago. Non-combat, medical leave, long-term, not coming back. We've been operating at reduced capacity since then, and we have 3 mission cycles coming up in the next 4 months that we cannot run without a full complement." Sarah said nothing. She was very still. "I'll be direct," Trace said. "Reyes filed an incident report on the transport this morning. Standard procedure. But the report included a personal notation, which is not standard procedure, and Reyes doesn't do things that aren't standard procedure unless he has a specific reason." He looked at Reyes briefly. Reyes said, "You caught what 2 of my guys missed for 45 minutes in a moving aircraft. You did it in 8 seconds on a roof, and you kept him present." He looked at Webb. He was starting to go inward. "We've seen it before. When people go inward after that kind of blood loss, the body follows. You kept him out." Webb was looking at Sarah. He was doing it with the particular steadiness of someone who doesn't look away from things, who has trained himself to meet situations directly rather than approaching them sideways. "I remember your voice," he said. "That's all I remember from the roof. Just your voice." The room was very quiet. Sarah looked at the table for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked up. "What would this involve?" she said. Her voice was even, professional. She was not going to let the moment pull her sideways, because decisions made inside emotional moments were not always decisions you could live with afterward. Trace walked her through it. The details were spare, necessarily, given what could and could not be said in a room like this, but clear enough. 6-month initial assignment, classified operational deployment, meaning she would not be able to discuss the nature of her work with anyone outside the unit. Training period of 8 weeks at a facility she would be given the address for after she signed the preliminary agreement. Physical requirements, psychological evaluation, security clearance process. "Your record will be reviewed thoroughly," Trace said. "Everything, all of it." He paused just slightly. "Including your time at Rampart." Something in Sarah's chest tightened. "And if the review of my time at Rampart includes formal complaints and counseling notations, then the review will also include your patient outcome data, your error rate, your documented interventions, and the notation filed this morning by Chief Petty Officer Reyes." Trace looked at her without blinking. We don't evaluate people by who complained about them. We evaluate them by what they do when it matters. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Paulson's office. She thought about the chart hitting the floor. She thought about 3 years of reports, filed and filed and filed and never acted on. She thought about the corporal in room 4, whose wife had brought flowers. She thought about Marcus Webb on the roof, holding her wrist. "I have patience," she said. It was what she had said to Reyes that afternoon, and she meant it the same way now. Not as a refusal, but as a condition, as a statement of who she was. "I have patients in this unit right now who are in the middle of their care plans. I won't walk away from them in the middle of something." 2 weeks notice, Trace said. Standard transition. We can work with that. "And the 8-week training," she said. "I want full access to the clinical protocols before I begin. I don't walk into medical situations without understanding the system I'm working in." "That can be arranged, and I wanted in writing that my nursing license and hospital privileges remain intact and renewable during the assignment period, regardless of the classified nature of the work." Trace almost smiled. It was a very small movement, but it was there. "Also arranged," he said. Reyes was looking at the wall, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested he was keeping his own expression under careful control. Webb said quietly, "She negotiated better than I did." "You negotiated in a parking lot," Reyes said. "She's negotiating post-shift. Different energy." Sarah looked at Webb. He was watching her with that steady, direct gaze, and she thought, not for the first time today, that he was going to be all right. Not just physically, something else. The kind of all right that comes from having gone through something and come out the other side still knowing who you are. "You should lie back down," she said. "In a minute," he said. "Now," she said. And then, because this was her professional opinion, and she was still a nurse, and he was still her patient in the technical sense, "Your blood pressure is going to drop if you stay upright much longer. You went through surgery 4 hours ago. The sitting up is impressive, and it means nothing physiologically." Webb looked at Trace. Trace looked back with the expression of a man who was not going to intervene in this particular exchange. Webb lay back down. "Thank you," Sarah said. She stayed another 20 minutes going through the preliminary paperwork that Trace produced from a folder she hadn't noticed him carrying, initialing the sections she was prepared to initial, and flagging 2 clauses she wanted legal language clarified on, because she read what she signed, always without exception. Trace flagged the clauses, did not argue about them, made a note. When she left the room, the hallway was still quiet. The nurse at the far station was on the phone, not looking her way. The elevator came quickly. She rode it down to the ground floor and walked out of the building into the evening air and stood very still for a moment, because she needed one moment of not moving. Just one. Then her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it, but something, the same instinct that had kept her employed and her patients alive for 22 years, told her to pick up. "This is Stevens," she said. The voice on the other end was female, clipped, professional. "Nurse Stevens, this is Commander Patricia Hale, TMSU-7. Admiral Trace asked me to make contact. Welcome to the unit." A pause. "Preliminary, pending review." "Understood," Sarah said. "One thing," Commander Hale said. "Reyes told me what you did this morning, the secondary injury call. It was—" "I know what you're going to say," Hale said. "Don't say it. Just hear me. That call saved him from a complication that would have presented 6 hours post-op and would have been considerably harder to manage than the original wound." Another pause. "I've been doing this work for 11 years. I've seen a lot of nurses. I've seen maybe 3 people who would have caught that on a rooftop in 8 seconds. She let that land. "So when you start the training and they push you, and they will push you because that is the nature of the training, I want you to remember this conversation." "All right," Sarah said. "Get some sleep," Hale said. "Tomorrow's still a regular shift." The line went dead. Sarah put her phone in her pocket, started walking toward the parking structure. She was halfway there when she heard her name. She turned. It was Jessica Crane, of all the people, standing at the side entrance of the building in her street clothes, clearly just clocked out, clearly not having expected to see Sarah here. They looked at each other across about 15 feet of concrete in the fading evening light. Jessica opened her mouth, closed it again. Something was moving across her face that Sarah had genuinely never seen there before. Not satisfaction, not the sideways cruelty, not the performance of concern. Something younger than all of that. Something that looked like it cost something. "The patient this morning," Jessica said finally. "Webb, is he going to be okay?" Sarah looked at her. "He's stable," she said. "Prognosis is good." Jessica nodded. She was looking at the ground now. Her arms were crossed in a way that seemed less like armor and more like she was holding something in. "I heard what you did. On the roof," she paused. "The secondary injury thing." "Jessica, I filed that complaint this morning," Jessica said. "Very fast, like if she didn't say it quickly, she wouldn't say it at all." "The medication log one, I filed it." She looked up. "I know you know it was me." Sarah said nothing. "And I know the reason you know is that you've been watching me for 3 years, the same way I've been watching you," Jessica said. "Except you watch me because that's how you work, and I watched you because—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Because I was afraid of you." The evening air moved between them. "I'm not a threat to you," Sarah said quietly. "I know that now," Jessica said. "I knew it before, actually. That's the part I'm not proud of." She looked away again. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to say it." Sarah studied her for a long moment. Jessica Crane, who had been laughing into her coffee cup that morning, while Sarah picked papers up off the floor. Jessica Crane, who had said, "He's not wrong," though with the careful pleasure of someone drawing blood. Jessica Crane, who was standing in a parking lot in the dark, telling the truth because something in this day had shaken loose a thing she'd been holding down for 3 years. People were not simple. That was the thing Sarah had learned over and over in 22 years of sitting with people at the worst moments of their lives. They were not simple. They were afraid, and they were tired, and they did terrible small things, and occasionally, when something big enough happened, they stood in parking lots and told the truth. "I withdrew my complaint," Jessica said suddenly. "This afternoon. I called Paulson's office and withdrew it." Sarah blinked. "I know it doesn't undo anything," Jessica said. "I know it's not enough, but it's what I did." Sarah exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" Jessica looked at her like she'd expected something else. "Okay," Sarah said again. "Not forgiveness, not yet, and maybe not in the way Jessica was hoping for. And Sarah was not going to perform an absolution she hadn't fully arrived at. But acknowledgement, recognition, the smallest opening of a door that had been closed for 3 years. "Get some rest," she said. "It's been a long day." She turned and walked to her car. She sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. The hospital was lit up behind her, the way hospitals always are. That particular quality of light that never quite goes off, that says someone is always here, always working, always keeping watch. She thought about the note in her pocket. Room 42, 7:15. She thought about Commander Hale's voice on the phone. 3 people in 11 years. She thought about Rhea saying, "You stayed with him. Good call." She thought about Marcus Webb lying back down when she told him to. Not because she outranked him. She absolutely did not. But because she was right, and he knew it. And that was the only authority that had ever mattered to her. Not rank, not volume, not the performance of confidence. Just the authority of knowing what you're doing and doing it without apology and without announcement. She started the engine. Tomorrow was a regular shift. She had patients who needed her. She had 2 weeks to give this floor everything she had left to give it. the same everything she'd been giving it for 3 years, without acknowledgement, without ceremony, without anyone leaving her name on a note that said, "Welcome to the unit." That was changing. Not because a helicopter had landed, not because an admiral had sat in a chair in room 42 and called her by name. It was changing because it had always been going to change. Because the truth about a person is not a thing that can be suppressed indefinitely. Because doing the right thing quietly and consistently and over a long period of time is not invisibility. It is accumulation. And some things, when they finally add up to enough, don't just change, they arrive. She pulled out of the parking structure and drove home in the dark. Behind her, in room 42 on the 3rd floor of Rampart Military Medical Center, Marcus Webb was lying flat in a hospital bed, looking at the ceiling with clear eyes and steady vitals. And the monitor beside him beeped with the unhurried rhythm of a man who was going to be fine. Rhea sat in the chair by the door, arms crossed, awake. "You think she'll sign?" Webb asked. Reyes didn't answer immediately. He thought about a woman on a roof who had known in 8 seconds what 45 minutes in a helicopter hadn't told anyone else. "Yeah," he said, "she'll sign." She signed the preliminary agreement the next morning at 7:03, standing at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, using the pen she kept in the drawer next to the takeout menus because it was the only pen in her apartment that reliably worked. She initialed each page carefully, read every line she had not read the night before, and when she was done, she folded the papers exactly as they had been folded, put them in the envelope that had been left with the documents, and placed the envelope in her bag. Then she finished getting ready for work. The drive to Rampart took 19 minutes. She used 16 of them thinking about nothing clinical, nothing strategic, nothing related to Admiral Trace or Commander Hale or Room 42 or TM-SU-7. She used them thinking about her mother, who had been a practical woman in the specific way that practical people are when they have had to be. A woman who had raised 2 children mostly alone and who had told Sarah once, when Sarah was 12 years old and crying about something a girl at school had said about her, "The ones who go quiet when they should go loud are not weak. They're just saving it." She had not known at 12 what her mother meant by that. She thought she understood it better now. She walked into Rampart at 7:18 and went directly to the nurse's station. The morning was already moving. Overnight had left a backlog. 2 patients who had been readmitted in the small hours, one with a post-surgical complication and one with a fever that had spiked badly enough to require monitoring. Sarah pulled both charts before she took her jacket off, read them standing up, and by 7:25 had already identified 3 things that needed to be addressed before rounds. Danny was at the station, looking like she had been there since the previous night, which was possible given the state of the staffing situation. She looked at Sarah with the specific expression of someone who has been holding a question all morning and is about to lose control of it. "Is it true?" Danny said. Sarah looked up. "Is what true?" That someone from the military was asking about you. Specifically? Like looking at your file and asking people questions? Sarah kept her face entirely neutral. "Where did you hear that?" "Carla told someone, and that someone told me." Danny's voice had dropped to the register people use when they are performing discretion while actually broadcasting. "She said someone from the Navy was here last night, after hours, in a private room, and that you were..." "Danny." Sarah's voice was not unkind, but it was definitive. "I need you to focus on the patient in room 9, whose fever chart hasn't been updated since 4 a.m., and I need you to do it before Dr. Ewan gets here in 10 minutes. Danny closed her mouth, opened it, closed it again. "Right," she said. "Yes, okay." She moved. Sarah went back to the charts. She was aware in the peripheral way that she was always aware of everything, that 2 other nurses at the far end of the station had heard that exchange and were now doing the thing where they appear to be working while actually watching. She did not acknowledge it. She finished the charts. By 8:15, rounds had begun. The fever patient had been reassessed, and the post-surgical complication had been flagged to the attending with sufficient clarity that action was taken within 20 minutes of Sarah's notation. She moved through the morning with the particular efficiency of someone who has made a decision and stopped carrying the weight of making it, lighter somehow than she had been yesterday, not because things were easier, but because the direction was clear. And then Dr. Holt walked onto the floor. He was 40 minutes later than his usual start time, which was unusual. His expression when he came through the door was the expression of a man who had received information recently that he had not enjoyed receiving. He went straight to the station, picked up the first chart, scanned it, set it down, picked up the second. His jaw was tight. Sarah was 3 feet away, updating a medication log. She did not look up. Holt set down the second chart. Stevens, Dr. Holt. My office, 10 minutes. He walked away before she could respond, which was his standard technique. Issue the directive, withdraw before a response is possible. Establish through the mechanics of the invitation itself that this is a summons rather than a request. Sarah had watched him do it to other people for 3 years. This was the first time he had done it to her directly, in that tone, with that jaw. She finished the medication log, checked on the patient in room 9, confirmed the fever was trending down, then walked to Holt's office and knocked on the open door. He was behind his desk. He did not gesture for her to sit, so she stood, which she had been going to do anyway. Close the door, he said. She closed it. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man trying to decide which version of a conversation he wants to have. Then he said, "Someone ran a personnel inquiry on you last night through the military command channel, requesting your full employment history, your clinical record, your incident reports, and your performance evaluations." Sarah said nothing. "I was notified," he continued, "because as senior attending I am listed as a supervisory reference on your record. They contacted me for a verbal evaluation at 7 this morning." He paused. "They called me at home." "I'm sorry if that was inconvenient," Sarah said. "That's not—" He stopped. He was doing something she had never quite seen him do before, which was struggling to locate the correct footing for a conversation. Holt was a man who always knew where he stood. The uncertainty looked strange on him, like a coat that didn't fit. "Did you know about this?" "I was informed there might be an inquiry," she said carefully. "I wasn't given specific details about the process." "An inquiry," he repeated. His voice had something in it now that she had to work to identify. And when she identified it, she was surprised. It was not anger. It was something closer to unease. "Stevens, do you understand what unit that inquiry came from?" "I have some understanding of it, yes." He stared at her, genuinely stared, in a way that Dr. Raymond Holt, senior attending, did not generally stare at nurses. "How long have you—" He stopped again, reset. "The patient yesterday, Webb, you knew who he was." "I read his chart." "Before the chart," Holt said. "On the roof. You knew before the chart." Sarah held his gaze. She said nothing because there was nothing to say that was both true and fully disclosable. And she had learned a long time ago that silence was not the same as admission. Holt sat back in his chair. Something was happening behind his eyes, a recalculation, the specific cognitive adjustment of a person who has been operating on a set of assumptions and has just had one of them definitively removed. "I gave you a verbal evaluation this morning," he said slowly. "When they called." Sarah waited. "I told them your clinical outcomes were strong. Your error rate was the lowest in the department. Your patient response under high-pressure conditions was—" He said the next word like it cost him something. "Exceptional." The room was very quiet. "I also told them," he said, and his voice shifted slightly, losing the stiffness, becoming something more unguarded than she had ever heard from him, "that I had filed 2 incident reports about you in the last 18 months that were based primarily on my own frustration with your methodology, rather than any genuine clinical concern. He looked at the desk. They asked me specifically whether I stood behind those reports. I told them I did not. Sarah felt something move through her that she could not entirely name. It was not satisfaction. It was not relief. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. The particular feeling of hearing a truth spoken out loud that you have held alone for a very long time. "Dr. Holt," she said. "Don't," he said, not unkindly. "Just don't. I'm not doing this I'm not asking for anything." He looked up. His face was tired. Not the tired of a long day, but the tired of someone who has been carrying something heavy in a direction he wasn't sure about. "You're leaving, aren't you?" It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, a short, precise movement. Then he picked up a chart from his desk and opened it, which was his way of ending conversations. And Sarah recognized the dismissal for what it was. Not contempt this time, but something closer to the retreat of a man who has said what he needed to say and does not know what comes next. She opened the door. "Stevens," his voice stopped her. She turned. "The hemostatic gauze you sent in yesterday," he said, not looking up from the chart. "The secondary site." He paused. It was the right call. She held the doorframe for 1 second. "I know," she said. She walked back to the floor. By 10:30, the story had moved through the ward in the specific way that stories move through hospital wards, in fragments, with embellishments, carried by people who had only part of the information and were filling in the gaps with their own interpretations. Sarah heard 3 different versions of it before noon. One in which she had been recruited by the CIA, one in which she had been Webb's nurse on a previous classified mission and their connection was pre-planned, and one delivered with the breathless urgency of someone who believed they were sharing a secret that simply said she was not who any of them had thought she was. That last one was the closest to true, she thought, not because she had been hiding anything, but because people had not been looking. The version that traveled fastest, she noticed, was the one that moved through the doctors. By 11, 3 different physicians who had never spoken to her with anything other than functional professionalism had made a point of stopping at the nurses' station to review charts they could have reviewed elsewhere. 2 of them asked her direct questions about patient cases they could have directed to anyone on the floor. One of them, Dr. Morrow, a cardiologist who had passed her in hallways for 2 years without acknowledgement, stopped beside her while she was checking a monitor and said, with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than performance, "I heard you called a fragmentation secondary on a GSW shoulder in 8 seconds yesterday, on a rooftop." "The patient was guarding the lateral side," Sarah said, not looking up from the monitor. "It wasn't complicated." Morrow was quiet for a moment. "I've had attendings miss that in a fully equipped bay," he said. "Then they weren't watching," Sarah said. Morrow made a sound that was not quite a laugh and walked away. At 12:40, Reyes appeared on the floor. He was not in the building for her, or not primarily. He went first to the 3rd floor, which she knew because Danny tracked his movement with the dedicated attention of someone who had decided this particular situation was the most interesting thing that had happened at Rampart in recent memory, and reported back with an update that Sarah had not requested, and acknowledged without encouragement. When Reyes came down to the primary floor, he stopped at the station and waited until she was between tasks. "Walk with me," he said. They went to the family consultation room again, apparently their room now, by default. "He wants to see you," Reyes said. No preamble. "He should be resting," Sarah said. "I told him that." Reyes looked at her with the expression of a man who has argued a point once, lost, and declined to argue it again. He said, and I'm quoting, "She'll say the same thing, and then she'll come anyway, because she's going to want to check the lateral site." Sarah looked at the wall for a moment. "The lateral site should be monitored for pressure changes in the first 48 hours, she said. "It's standard post-fragmentation protocol." "I know," Reyes said. "So it's a clinical visit." Of course, Reyes said. His face was completely straight. She went upstairs. Webb was sitting up again. She had expected this, which meant she had also prepared for it. And she walked in with the specific manner of someone who has already decided how this is going to go and is not going to be charmed out of it. "Lie down," she said. "Nice to see you too," he said. "Blood pressure, lateral monitoring, 48-hour protocol," she said. "Lie down." He lay down. There was something easy in the way he did it. Not reluctant, not performing compliance, just the adjustment of a person who has decided to trust someone's judgment and is not making a production of the decision. She checked the lateral site, noted the pressure readings, confirmed what she had expected to confirm. "Looks good," she said. "I know," he said. "Hale told me this morning." She stepped back from the bed. He was watching her with that steady, direct attention that she had noticed on the roof, and again in the room the previous night. The particular focus of a person who has spent a long time learning to read situations quickly and accurately, and who was currently applying that skill to her. "You signed," he said. "Preliminary," she said. "Pending review." "You signed," he said again. Like the pending review was a formality he was not particularly concerned about. She looked at him. "You knew yesterday. On the roof," she said. "Before anyone said anything to me. You already knew." Webb was quiet for a moment. "Reyes had flagged you 3 weeks ago," he said, "before the mission. He found your Mercy General records during a routine facility assessment. He put your name in a report." He paused. "I read the report." 3 weeks ago, Sarah said. 3 weeks ago, he confirmed. She processed this. The helicopter landing on the roof had not been coincidence. The transport to Rampart had not been a random assignment. The facility had been chosen, at least in part, because of a name in a report that a man she had never met had written based on records from a hospital she had left 3 years ago. "The roof," she said slowly. "You holding my wrist." "I needed to know if you were going to stay," he said simply. Not manipulative, just honest. The way people are honest when they have been trained to strip everything down to the functional core. People either stay or they look for a reason to defer. In 40 seconds, I know which. "And? You stayed," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. Outside the room, somewhere in the building, a monitor chimed and a voice responded to it, and the ordinary machinery of the hospital continued its constant motion. "I have conditions," she said. "Trace told me," he said. "They're reasonable." "I have one more," she said. "One that wasn't in the paperwork last night." He waited. "If I join this unit," she said, "I function as an equal clinical authority within my scope. Not support staff, not background. If I make a call in the field, it stands unless someone with direct clinical training overrides it with a specific clinical reason. Not rank, not habit, a reason." Webb looked at her steadily. "That's how we operate," he said. "I'm told that's how you operate," she said. "I want to hear it from you directly." Something in his expression shifted. The smallest movement, the recognition of a person meeting another person at full strength, rather than at a safe diplomatic distance. "That's how we operate," he said. "You have my word." She held his gaze for one more second, then she nodded once, with the finality of a person who has made a decision, and closed the door on the making of it. She was at the door when his voice caught her again. "Stevens." She turned. In the elevator going back down, she stood very still and let the building carry her. And she thought about 22 years of doing the right thing in rooms where nobody was watching. And about a man who had read a report 3 weeks ago with her name in it. And about the particular weight of being seen, not performed at, not managed, not evaluated from a distance, but actually seen by someone who had learned the hard way how to tell the difference between what a person showed you and what they actually were. It was a strange feeling. Not bad, just new. The way new things feel when they are also, somehow, things you have always been moving toward. She stepped off the elevator and walked back onto the floor. Jessica was at the station. She looked up when Sarah came in, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. And then Jessica said, quietly and without the layered architecture of all her previous communications, "There's a family waiting in room 6. They've been there 40 minutes. Danny was going to go in, but I think they should be talking to you." Sarah looked at her. "Room 6 is your patient," Jessica said. It was not a concession. It was an acknowledgement. The difference was real, and both of them knew it. "Thank you," Sarah said. She went to room 6. The family inside, a woman in her 60s and 2 adult sons, all 3 of them sitting with the particular held stillness of people who have been afraid for a long time and are trying not to let it show, looked up when she came in, and she saw in their faces the things she had seen 1,000 times in 1,000 rooms. The desperate, particular hope that the person who just walked through the door knows what they are doing. She sat down across from them. "Tell me what you're most worried about," she said. "Not what the doctors said, what you're worried about." The woman's hands unclasped. One of the sons exhaled. The other leaned forward. And Sarah Stevens, who was 2 weeks from leaving this floor, who had signed a preliminary agreement that morning with a pen from the drawer next to the takeout menus, who had been called a liability and a disruption and had charts thrown out of her hands, and been told repeatedly that her place was to hand tools and follow instructions. Sarah Stevens sat in that room and gave that family her full and complete and unhurried attention because they were in front of her and they needed her. And that had always been, from the very beginning, the only reason she ever needed. Down the hall at the nurse's station, Jessica Crane looked at the door to room 6 for a long moment. Then she picked up a chart and started working. And somewhere on the 3rd floor, Marcus Webb lay in a hospital bed with steady vitals and clear eyes, and Reyes sat in the chair by the door, and neither of them spoke, because some things don't need to be said when both people already know them. The unit hummed with its ordinary noise. Monitors beeped. Phones rang. Someone somewhere was being helped, and someone somewhere was being afraid, and someone was keeping watch. That was what hospitals were. That was what they had always been. And for 2 more weeks, Sarah Stevens was still one of the people keeping watch. The 2 weeks passed the way the last 2 weeks of anything important always pass. Faster than they should, and with a weight that accumulated quietly, the way snow accumulates on a surface you aren't watching, until suddenly the surface is changed, and you cannot quite remember when it happened. Sarah worked every shift. She did not coast. She did not mentally check out in the way that people sometimes do when they know an ending is coming, when the next chapter is already visible enough that the current one starts to feel like a formality. She worked with the same precision and the same presence she had brought to every shift for 3 years at Rampart, because the patients in front of her did not know she was leaving, and their need did not adjust itself to her timeline. She put in her formal resignation on day 3. Director Paulson received it in person, read it at her desk while Sarah stood across from her, and then set it down and looked at Sarah with the expression of a woman doing a specific internal accounting. "Military reassignment," Paulson read from the form. "Classified nature of new position." She looked up. "How long have you been planning this?" "I haven't been planning it long," Sarah said, which was entirely true. Paulson looked at her for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for the counseling session, for the way I handled the complaints." "You handled them the way the system required," Sarah said. "The system was wrong," Paulson said. "I knew it was wrong when I was doing it." She folded her hands on the desk. "That's worse, I think, than just not knowing." Sarah did not argue with that. "The staffing situation," she said instead. "The reports I filed. There are 3 of them, going back 14 months. They're accurate, and they're documented, and they need action. My leaving doesn't change that. It makes it more urgent." Paulson nodded slowly. "I'll move them forward." "In writing," Sarah said. "I'd like confirmation in writing before my last day." Paulson looked at her with something that was close to respect and close to something else. The particular expression of a person recognizing, too late, what they had been sitting across from all along. "All right," she said, in writing. Sarah got the written confirmation on day 9. She filed it in her personal records. She did not celebrate it because it was not a victory, it was a correction. And corrections were not things you celebrated, they were things you documented and moved forward from. On day 11, Holt found her at the nurse's station at 6:45 in the morning, before the day had properly started, before anyone else was in yet. He stood beside her at the counter and looked at the board and did not look at her directly, which she had come to understand was how he managed conversations he found difficult. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the way this unit functions, the reporting structure, the way information moves between nursing staff and attending physicians." Sarah waited. "I think there are inefficiencies," he said, which, coming from Holt, was approximately the equivalent of another person saying, "I think I have been fundamentally wrong about several things for a significant period of time." "There are," she said, neutrally, not twisting the knife, not performing graciousness either, just confirming the truth of it. "I've asked Paulson to establish a structured clinical feedback protocol," he said, "formalized, so that nursing observations are documented and reviewed as part of standard rounds rather than—" He stopped. "Rather than being filtered through the personal dynamics of the attending." Sarah set down her pen and looked at him directly. He was still looking at the board. "That's a good change," she said. "It's overdue," he said. They stood in the quiet of the early morning for a moment, the two of them, with the distance of 3 years of friction between them, and something else now too. Not warmth exactly, not yet, possibly never, but a recognition of mutual reality that had not been there before. "You're going to be good at whatever it is you're going to be doing," he said, still not looking at her. "I don't need to know what it is to know that." Sarah looked at the side of his face for 1 second. "Thank you, Raymond," she said. She had never called him by his first name before. He stiffened slightly, just slightly, and then something in him settled, and he picked up a chart from the counter and walked toward the ward, and that was that. On day 13, Webb was discharged. She knew because Reyes texted her. A single line, no punctuation, exactly the way she would have expected a message from him to look. "He's out, doing well, says thank you." She read it in the break room, between patients, and held her phone for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she texted back, "Tell him to follow the lateral protocol for another 3 weeks." Reyes replied in 4 seconds. "Already told him. He ignored it. Maybe you tell him." She put her phone away. She was smiling, which surprised her slightly. Not the fact of it, but the ease of it, the way it arrived without requiring anything from her. On her last official day at Rampart, Sarah Stevens arrived at 7:06 in the morning, which was 6 minutes later than her usual time, which for her was essentially sleeping in. She brought coffee, not for herself, but for the nurses on the floor, a tray from the good place 3 blocks over that she had stopped at on the way in. Not a grand gesture, just coffee, just the ordinary acknowledgement of people who had worked beside her, imperfectly, as people always work beside each other. Danny cried. She had not entirely expected that. Danny stood at the nurse's station holding her coffee cup and cried with the specific, unguarded emotion of a young person who has not yet learned to modulate feeling for professional settings. And Sarah put a hand briefly on her arm and said with complete sincerity, "You're going to be good at this. You already are. You just need to trust what you know." Danny wiped her face with her sleeve. "How do you know what you know?" she asked. "Like, how do you get to where you are? How do you—" "I always feel like I'm 1 step behind, like everyone else knows things I haven't figured out yet." Sarah thought about it, really thought about it, because the question deserved a real answer, and Danny deserved to hear one. "You stop trying to know everything, and you start watching what's in front of you," she said. "You watch the patient, not the chart, not the monitor, the patient. Everything else is data. The patient is the truth. Danny looked at her. That's it? That's the core of it, Sarah said. The rest is just practice. She worked her full shift. Every patient, every chart, every task that was hers to do, she did completely. She did not leave early. She did not let the occasion of the day make the day about anything other than what it needed to be about. At 4:30 in the afternoon, with 90 minutes left in her shift, she was in the corridor outside room 6 when her phone rang. Unknown number. She stepped to the side of the hallway and answered. "Stevens," said Commander Hale's voice. "Clearance came through an hour ago. Full approval across all categories." A pause that contained the very specific weight of what full approval across all categories meant. "Training begins Monday. I'm sending the address to the secure contact we established. You'll need to arrive by 0700. "I'll be there," Sarah said. "One thing," Hale said, and her voice shifted. "Not much, but enough." The professional precision softened by 1 degree, just one, in the specific way of someone who is choosing to speak as a person rather than as a rank. "I've been where you're standing. Different hospital, different people, same dynamic, 12 years ago." She paused. "The first week of training is going to make you want to argue with every instructor you meet because you will be right and some of them will be wrong, and the training structure will not always accommodate that." "All right," Sarah said. "Don't argue," Hale said. "Watch. Learn the system completely before you start improving it, because you will improve it. I'm counting on that, frankly. But you cannot improve what you don't yet understand from the inside." Sarah thought about this. About 3 years of reports filed through proper channels. About the difference between being right in isolation and being effective within a structure. "Understood," she said. "Good," Hale said. And then, with the brevity of someone who has said exactly what needed to be said, and not a word more, "See you Monday." The line went dead. Sarah stood in the corridor for 10 seconds. Then she walked back to room 6. The last 90 minutes of her last shift at Rampart Military Medical Center passed without incident, without ceremony, without any of the dramatic markers that the occasion might have warranted in a different kind of story. She updated her final charts with the same thoroughness she had given every chart for 3 years. She briefed the incoming shift nurse, a woman named Torres who was new to the unit and competent and careful, on the status of each patient, not rushing, not condensing, making sure every relevant detail was transferred with the same fidelity it deserved. Torres listened and took notes and asked 3 good questions, which told Sarah everything she needed to know about Torres. At 6:15, Sarah Stevens clocked out of Rampart for the last time. She was at the elevator when Jessica caught up with her. She was slightly out of breath, which told Sarah she had moved quickly from wherever she had been to get here before the elevator doors closed. And there was something in her face that was stripped of all the usual management. No performance, no careful word placement, just a woman with something to say and not much time to say it. "I know it's too late," Jessica said. "For most of it, I know that." "Jessica, I spent 3 years making your job harder than it needed to be," Jessica said. "Not all the time, not in the big ways, in the small ways, the constant small ways that don't look like anything individually but add up to." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I know it doesn't undo it, but I want you to know that I know what I did, specifically, not in a vague, I could have been nicer way, specifically." Sarah looked at her. The elevator doors opened. Neither of them moved. "Why?" Sarah said, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. "Why did you?" Jessica's jaw tightened. "Because you were better at this than me," she said, "in the ways that actually matter, the patient ways, and I didn't know how to be in the same room as that without making it about something else." The elevator doors closed. Neither of them had moved to stop them. "I'm going to get better at this job," Jessica said. "After you leave, I'm going to get better at it because..." She stopped, looked away. "Because you did something yesterday in room 6 with that family, and I watched from the window for about 30 seconds, And I understood what I have not been doing, what I have been doing instead of that. Sarah was quiet for a moment. The hallway was empty. The hospital hummed around them. You're already better at it than you think, Sarah said. The watching, the fact that you watched and saw it and understood what you were seeing, that's not nothing. That's actually the first step. Jessica looked at her. You're leaving in about 45 seconds and you're still teaching. Occupational habit, Sarah said. Jessica made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something more complicated. She extended her hand. Good luck, she said, with whatever it is. Sarah shook it. Good luck with this floor, she said. They need someone who cares. She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened immediately this time, as if the building itself had been waiting. She stepped in. Jessica stood in the hallway and watched the doors close and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say that would have been as honest as the silence. The elevator went down. Sarah walked out of the building for the last time, just as the evening was beginning. That particular quality of light that sits at the edge of late afternoon and early evening, when the day is not quite done, but the night is already preparing. She walked to her car. She put her bag in the passenger seat. She sat for a moment. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up expecting Reyes or Hale or a confirmation number for the address she'd been promised. It was from a number she had not yet saved, but recognized from the single time it had appeared on her screen before. Marcus Webb. The message was short, characteristically short, in the way she was beginning to understand was simply how he communicated, efficiently, without decoration, with the precision of someone who chose his words because he meant them and not for any other reason. It said, Hale told me you cleared. I told her I already knew. See you Monday, Stevens. She read it once, read it again. Then she set the phone down on the passenger seat and looked forward through the windshield at the hospital she had spent 3 years of her life in, at the building that had thrown her chart on the floor and filed complaints about her and called her invisible and told her to stay in her lane. She thought about 22 years. She thought about her mother. She thought about the first time she had sat with a patient who was afraid and had understood, in the clearest possible way, what her presence in that room was worth. Not her credentials, not her certifications, not the metrics on her performance evaluation, but her actual presence, the specific quality of her attention, the fact of her being there and being steady and refusing to look away. She had never needed anyone to tell her that was worth something. She had always known. But there is a difference between knowing your worth in solitude and having it confirmed by the world. There is a difference between carrying a truth alone and having it spoken back to you by someone who learned it the same hard way you did. There is a difference between being seen by yourself and being seen. Sarah Stevens started her car. She drove away from Rampart for the last time, and she did not look in the rearview mirror. Not because the past did not matter, but because it was behind her now in the specific way that things are behind you when you have finished them completely. Not abandoned, not escaped from, but fully inhabited and fully closed. The way you close a door on a room you have cleaned, knowing there is nothing left in it that belongs to you. Monday was 4 days away. She had 4 days to pack what she needed, arrange what needed arranging, call her mother, sleep a full night, and arrive at an address she had never been to by 7 in the morning to begin the next chapter of a life that had been quietly accumulating toward this moment for longer than anyone watching from the outside had thought to notice. She merged onto the highway. The city opened up around her. Other people were going home from work, ordinary and busy and unaware, and she was one of them, just a woman in a car at the end of a shift, moving through the ordinary evening of the world. Except that she was not, and she had never been, and the difference was not something she wore loudly or announced or performed. It was simply something she was, had always been. The quiet ones, her mother had said, are just saving it. Sarah Stevens had been saving it for 22 years. She was done saving it now.